Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. I'm your host, David Appleson. This will be a brief update to let you know about the next 5 episodes scheduled for the podcast. But before going into that, I just wanted to speak briefly about putting historical disasters into perspective. While we devote our time in this podcast to discussing and analyzing major disasters, some of which happened relatively recently, it is important to acknowledge that in the grand scope of history, we are actually very fortunate to live in the times that we do. In fact, I don't think it is a reach to say that we live in charmed times, certainly the best time in the history of humanity. At more than 7 billion people, the population of the Earth has never been this large before, nor increased so rapidly. Keep in mind, there have been times when the population has remained incredibly stable or even declined. Such a prolonged period of global growth is outside of the norm. How do we explain such a remarkable feat? Although we may fear the spreading of the war in Syria and conflict in other places, the last few decades have been incredibly peaceful, with fewer wars than usual. If you look just at the history of Europe, for example, it's pretty much one nation or principality fighting another since the first villages popped up right to the end of World War II. There are also very few violent revolutions going on right now. Although it is difficult to tell what the immediate future will hold, most transitions of government in the developed world are at least happening peacefully. The average lifespan has also increased dramatically since the advent of the Industrial Revolution, and even more so since the end of World War II. That is occurring most extraordinarily in the developing world, where poverty has also shrunk to a considerable degree. Despite some of our poor eating and exercising habits in the West, my own included, people are far healthier than they have ever been. That is mostly attributable to people throughout the world being better fed than ever before and hunger becoming less and less of a global problem. Additionally, medical care has never been better, and modern medical care is now available on a scale never seen before. We've made remarkable progress reducing disease and hunger while making safe drinking water ever more accessible, meaning we are living healthier and longer lives. Infants are living longer as infant mortality rates have fallen dramatically. Both capitalism and democracy have contributed to a safer, healthier, and happier populace. When people feel they are more involved in asserting control over the actions of their governments, it frees up time for other pursuits such as careers, hobbies, and exercise. Even though pollution has been a topic in several episodes, laws and regulations enacted to make our lands, seas, and skies cleaner have saved millions of lives. Easier and more accessible travel, a rising educated class, and the internet, as well as other media, have made us a much more intelligent planet than ever before, making it easier to solve local and global problems. Discrimination based on race, religion, culture, gender, physical ability, and sexual orientation is at its lowest point ever, allowing nations and organizations to tap into a tremendous pool of resources to fill job opportunities and to help solve problems. And for all of the above reasons, unlike previous times in our history, we've never been better prepared to tackle our toughest problems, even those that threaten our existence as a species. Currently, the population of the world is at 7.6 billion and still climbing. It didn't even hit 1 billion until sometime in the 19th century. Growth has been exponential since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. That should be our number one indicator that the world as a whole is doing something right. Birth rates have actually been dropping dramatically over the last few decades, which means most of that growth is due to people living longer. Infant mortality is down, and young people are living long enough to become old people. War, disease, and internal conflict have been on the wane. Let's start with food. According to an article in Business Insider, in the 18th century, 20% of the people of England and France had access to so few calories they were physically unable to work. That means that 1 out of 5 people were not contributing to the economy, and therefore to the betterment of others simply because they did not have access to sufficient food. And England and France were 2 of the wealthiest countries in the world at that time. At the close of World War II, 50% of the global population was undernourished. By 1992, that figure had dropped to 19%. By 2016, that number was down to 11%. Hunger, a constant, widespread problem throughout our history, is disappearing. Poverty has also been greatly reduced, and some of the greatest gains in material wealth around the world have happened during the last 30 years, a period that many have derided as globalist. But globalism has been a great boon for many of the world's poorest nations and peoples, even if it has led to a few people earning billions for themselves. According to The Economist, the World Bank listed 42% of the world as being extremely poor in 1981. That is, they barely had enough money to eat and pay for essentials like shelter and clothing. By 2013, that figure had dropped to 10.7%. In 1820, 94% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty, according to Swedish historian Johan Norberg, author of the book Progress. And there were very few times in history when the figure wasn't that high, meaning for most of history, only 1 out of 20 people didn't live in poverty. The World Bank's latest estimate is that the global poverty level is now below 9%. We have almost completely reversed history in the last few decades. Much of that reversal has taken place in China and India, but includes many other areas as well in West Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and South America. The world has become a safer place. Despite what you hear and see in the news, we may be living in one of the most peaceful times ever. There is still war and rebellion, but it has dramatically decreased since World War II, and even more so in the last few decades. In an article in Slate by Steve Pinker and Andrew Mack, they said, "In a historically unprecedented development, the number of interstate wars has plummeted since 1945, and the most destructive kind of war, in which great powers or developed states fight each other, has vanished altogether. The last one was the Korean War. Today, the world rarely sees a major naval battle or masses of tanks and heavy artillery shelling each other across a battlefield. Far fewer people are dying as a result of armed conflict, and that is a remarkable reversal of most of our history." Homicide, which Pinker and Mack say takes 5 to 10 times as many people as war, has declined rapidly, particularly in the United States since the 1990s, and that includes all of the recent mass shootings in our country. Canada and England have also reported declines, as well as many other developed nations. An article in Maclean's states, "In Canada, crime rates are the lowest they've been in 50 years. Violence against women and children is also markedly down." The world is also a healthier place. For most of our history, the average life expectancy has hovered around 30 years. The world average is now up to 70, and in most developed nations it is around 80 years. That has made a huge difference and may be one of the main reasons why the global population has taken off. Clean drinking water, inoculations against major diseases, access to modern medicine, the flourishing of hospitals and clinics, and a constant flow of new medical discoveries has made us healthier than ever before. Medical care, just in the United States, is a multi-trillion-dollar industry and accounts for a major portion of our economy. Our behaviors have changed as well. Smoking, teen pregnancy, drinking, and death from communicable diseases are all down. And while obesity is climbing rapidly, history proves it is better to be overfed than underfed. Even if it doesn't look like it, we have made major inroads against pollution. China, among other nations, is making real progress, moving away from dependency on coal toward other less polluting sources of energy. We depend less on fossil fuels than we used to and continue to look for cleaner ways to produce energy. Norberg states, "If you look at the leading pollutants that we worried about in the 1970s, those which pollute our rivers and forests and so on, they've been reduced by something like 60% since the 1970s. We've reduced the amount of oil spilt in the ocean by 99% since the 1970s. In response to concerns about global warming, he goes on to say, "That's absolutely right, but when it comes to industrial pollution, that's a modern phenomenon. We must not forget that when we are creating these problems, we are often solving other problems which are worse for mankind. A measurement of 6 major pollutants in the UK showed a significant drop from 100 particles in a million in 1970 to less than 40 in 2015. While climate change is still a major concern, we should acknowledge that we have made major strides. We have also witnessed a great blooming of democracy, starting with England's civil war in the 17th century, which ended with the beheading of their king and the empowerment of their parliament. The world has been on an ever-increasing trajectory of expanded democratic institutions. That event, along with the gaining of independence by the United Provinces of the Netherlands, contributed to the thoughts and ideas that influenced the American colonies when they rebelled against their king. The establishment of democracy in the United States encouraged revolution in France against their monarchy, which set the groundwork for the revolutions that followed throughout Europe and South America during the 19th century. The defeat of fascism in World War II and communism during the spring uprisings of the late 1980s and early 1990s encouraged more nations to change to representative forms of government. Prior to the American Revolution, almost all countries were autocratically ruled. According to Freedom House, the number of democracies around the world has increased from 41 in 1974 to 123 in 2006. That represents 77% of the world population, with most of the 23% not free living in just one country, China. However, recent trends are showing a move away from that shift as some formerly democratic nations experiment with more autocratic forms of government. Finally, our greatest hope, and also maybe our greatest threat, may be the spread of education and the digital revolution in information. Norberg states the percentage of people able to read and write has quadrupled from 21% in 1900 to 86% in 2015. Higher education is playing an important part in our increasingly more intelligent and better connected world. According to Anna Valero in The Conversation, in 1900, just 1% of young people in the world were enrolled at a university. Over the course of the next century, this exploded to 20% as recognition of the value of higher education became widespread. This rapid rise in education has changed the human race from one often ruled by religious authorities to one more based on scientific reason. That change has allowed for many of the positive trends already mentioned. Education, public service, and research have led to gains in feeding the world, access to clean water, drops in disease and violence, better health, longer lives, and a greater understanding of foreign cultures, which in turn has contributed to a drop in devastating wars. The vast amounts of research now being conducted, unlike anything ever witnessed before, means the future offers even greater hope for increasing longevity, stopping wars, ending pollution, fighting disease, making us freer, wealthier, healthier, and better informed. It can also be argued that the rise of the internet, smartphones, tablets, computers, and the ability to seek out small groups of people scattered throughout the planet who share similar beliefs has made us more antagonistic toward each other, and started a trend of neo-tribalism in which people separated by distance are brought together by a common hatred of those perceived as different and untrustworthy. But it has also created motivated groups of people who desire to bring down the invisible walls that separate us. Pinker's book, released in 2011, was called The Better Angels of Our Nature. That title refers to a speech made by Abraham Lincoln during his 1861 inauguration. Here's a portion of that speech. The thoughts of worldly men are forever regulated by a moral law of gravitation, which, like the physical one, holds them down to earth. The bright glory of day and the silent wonders of a starlit night appeal to their minds in vain. There are no signs in the sun, or in the moon, or in the stars for their reading. They are like some wise men, who, learning to know each planet by its Latin name, have quite forgotten such small heavenly constellations as charity, forbearance, universal love, and mercy. Although they shine by night and day so brightly that the blind may see them, and who, looking upward at the spangled sky, see nothing there but the reflection of their own great wisdom and book learning. It is curious to imagine these people of the world, busy in thought, turning their eyes towards the countless spheres that shine above us, and making them reflect the only images their minds contain. So do the shadows of our own desires stand between us and our better angels, and thus their brightness is eclipsed. He concludes, "The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." The President was striving to say that we must overcome our personal convictions and vanity in order to comprehend the greatness of the mysteries of the universe, appreciate our potential as moralistic creatures, and learn to get along with each other as brothers and sisters. In order for us to continue this great era of prosperity, health, comfort, and freedom, we must learn to allow for competing ideologies. Although we seem to find no shortage of events and circumstances to complain about in our present society, there has never been a luckier time to be alive. We can continue to make the world a better place, or we can choose to pursue our darker demons by focusing on people as problems instead of potential solutions. It is my hope that the lessons of these podcasts is that we can always strive to improve our systems and methods, and that all of us may contribute to that effort. And now, on to our next 5 episodes. As always, it's no easy task paring down suggestions, and I've received some fantastic ones. I apologize if I did not take the time to thank contributing listeners for past suggestions, such as the Piper Alpha oil platform explosion, the Halifax and Texas City ship explosions, the Spanish flu, the crash of Concord Air France Flight 4590, the Batavia shipwreck, Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, and Hurricane Katrina. I'm sorry if your suggestion wasn't included at this time. With so many great choices, it's difficult to pare this list down to 5. Here's some of the topics I hope to include in future episodes. The Great Blizzard of 1888, which hit the northeast of the United States, the crash of Japanese Airlines Flight 123 in 1985, the sack of Rome in 1527, the Sultana shipwreck near Memphis, Tennessee in 1865, the Niterói circus fire in Brazil in 1961, and the overtopping of the Vajont Dam near Venice, Italy in 1963. Thank you for all of the great suggestions. Keep listening. These are excellent topics. So here we go. Episode 46 will be about the Donner Party. In April of 1846, George Donner and his brother Jacob packed up their families in covered wagons and headed out from Springfield, Illinois for a new life and opportunity in California. They would meet other westbound immigrants along the way who would accept George as their leader. They were the last emigrant group to take the California Trail that year, leaving in mid-May, when the ideal time would have been in mid-April. Worse yet, they opted to take a shortcut through Utah, promoted by a dishonest author, Lansford Hastings, who was trying to sell more copies of his guidebook. Hastings had never used the Hastings Trail himself. Through bravery and determination, the Donner Party forged a trail where no trail had been before and reached their last major obstacle, the Sierra Nevada mountain range, in early November. But misfortune surprised them again when an early blizzard trapped them in the mountains. As the party had lost most of their food supplies during their trek through Utah, they would now be forced to scrounge for food as winter set in. Based on a listener's suggestion, episode 47 will be about the Armenian genocide in Turkey from 1915 to 1917. The Armenians have been an ethnic group for thousands of years. Their homeland is based around Mount Ararat in present-day eastern Turkey. They were early adopters of Christianity, and they held out as a Christian outpost while most of their neighbors took up Islam as their faith. Their history is marked by a constant struggle for independence. In 1639, Western Armenia was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. Relations between Christians and Muslims ratcheted up during the 19th century as Ottoman influence declined in the area, and that of the European nations rose. Christian countries such as Greece and the Balkan nations broke free from Ottoman rule. In the late 19th century, an Armenian liberation movement began to form. The Ottoman Sultan used Kurds, another ethnic group, as a proxy army to harass and massacre Armenians. In 1895, an assembly of Armenians in Constantinople demanded reforms. That led to more massacres of Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. An early defeat of the Turks against the Russians during World War I was blamed on the Armenians, leading to more massacres. On April 24, 1915, Armenian intellectuals and community leaders were rounded up, deported, and later killed. That day came to be known as Red Sunday, and it marked the beginning of the genocide that would ultimately take 800,000 to 1.5 million lives. In episode 48, we will continue to talk about genocide by covering Pol Pot's systematic killing of perceived political opponents in Cambodia. In 1975, the Communist Party Khmer Rouge came to power after defeating the pro-Western government. The Khmer Rouge then began a series of measures to eliminate any of their perceived internal opponents and to transform their country into an agrarian-based communist society. Their first targets were members of the former government and anyone connected to former members, as well as professionals, intellectuals, Buddhist monks, and ethnic minorities. Their leader, Pol Pot, was determined to eliminate anyone who could potentially oppose him. Pot tried to cleanse Cambodian society along racial, social, and political lines. He banned the use of minority languages and banned the existence of more than 20 minority groups in a nation where such minorities made up 15% of the population. At the heart of the movement was a desire by the Khmer Rouge to return their glorious past when the Khmer Empire was at its height. To do that, Pot attempted to cut all ties with foreign nations and eliminate all modern influences. The Khmer Rouge reign of terror would last for 4 years until finally undone by a foreign invading army. In episode 49, we head toward a new frontier for the podcast, outer space. We will look at the 2 fatal accidents in the United States Space Shuttle program, the Challenger and the Columbia disasters. On January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger blew up 73 seconds into its flight during liftoff, killing all 7 members of the crew. The entire sequence of events was carried live on television as a shocked nation watched the spacecraft explode and break apart in front of their eyes. The explosion was caused by the failure of a joint in the solid rocket booster. The O-ring seals in the joint had not been designed to handle the unusually cold conditions present at launch that day. 17 years later, the Space Shuttle Columbia had finished its mission and was returning to Earth. During launch, a piece of foam insulation about the size of a suitcase broke off the exterior of the shuttle and struck the left wing of the orbiter. The impact created a 6 to 10 inch hole. That hole allowed hot atmospheric gases to penetrate and destroy the internal wing structure during re-entry, which caused the vehicle to become unstable and break apart, killing all 7 members aboard. As with the O-ring erosion problem that doomed the Space Shuttle Challenger, NASA management became accustomed to the phenomena of parts wearing down or breaking when no serious consequences resulted from these deficiencies. This phenomenon was termed normalization of deviance by sociologist Diane Vaughan, and we will explore that phenomenon and how it affects other endeavors. We will wrap things up with episode 50 about the terrible earthquake and tsunami that struck the Indian Ocean in 2004. On December 26th, an earthquake measuring approximately 9.2 on the seismic scale struck just off the west coast of Sumatra in Indonesia. It was the 3rd largest earthquake ever recorded. The shaking lasted between 8 and 10 minutes, and that is the longest duration ever recorded for an earthquake. It actually caused the entire planet to vibrate as much as 1 centimeter. Because it struck the ocean floor in a violent motion near a number of highly populated areas, the death toll was enormous, ranging from 230 to 280,000 people. Fatalities took place in 14 countries when ocean waves pushed inland, crushing and flooding everything in its path. Damage was observed from South Africa to Alaska, meaning it literally affected half the planet. The tsunami also presented a study in class differences. While most of the fatalities and injuries happened to the poorer people who were eking out a living in the coastal communities, the tsunami also caught by surprise the many wealthy tourists from Western developed nations that flocked to those coasts to enjoy their beautiful sandy beaches. We will take a look at how development along the coasts for hotels and for fishing helped contribute to the high death toll. Thank you for listening, and thank you for contributing to the podcast. I especially am grateful for all of the wonderful episode suggestions and apologize if I didn't get to yours this time around. I'll get cracking on the Donner Party with a plan for getting that episode uploaded for you either by the end of the month or in early June. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.